Hello, and welcome to the Imposter Syndrome Network podcast, where everyone belongs, especially if you think you don't. My name is Chris Grundeman, and this is the Stan Barber episode, which I think you're going to really enjoy. Stan has been involved in working with internet-based technologies since he started his first job in the profession as a computer systems administrator back in 1984, which means that he's been involved in the evolution of what we now think of as the internet today, from the ARPANET and its siblings like CSNet and BitNet, etc., into the NSFNet, and then into the commercial internet that we actually have right now. Stan's goal is to continue to provide technical leadership in networking and distributed computing, following the core ideals of the internet. And those ideals are centered on open collaboration to advance new ideas and technologies. Hi, Stan. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit further to the Imposter Syndrome Network?
Thank you, Chris. It's good to hear from you. We have worked together in the past, and it's good to see you again.
Absolutely.
I realize the people on the podcast may not be able to see us, but we can.
That's right.
I have a very kind of odd background for people who are in this business today, but it was not an odd background back when I started in 84, because we didn't have an internet. We didn't know, we didn't know a lot. What we have today would be something that would actually come to be. There weren't no cell phones, and communication was done primarily via modems and faxes. Very different environment. So I started out really when I was in college as a biochemist of all things. And that's what my degree is. I have a BA in biochemistry and psychology from Rice University. So being an information technologist was not exactly how my path would work out. And that has been kind of one of the fun things about my career, how it's evolved all the time. Today, when we typically look at people who are in this business, we are looking at, what kind of certifications do they have? Is the experience that they're doing relevant to the job that they're doing today? And the thing that I would say about that is all of that is great, but it should not be all the things you are, if you're in this business. One of the things that really attracted me to this business originally was the fact there was so many things happening in so many different directions that it was very, very much an intriguing and exciting place to be. Of course, back in 1984, we were inventing, some basic things like, BGP and SMTP and NNTP. Of course, NNTP is not really around as much today, but all of these things that fostered collaboration and fostered the flow of, TCP/IP globally. And then, of course, there were the things that were going on that were at a lower level, like the explosion of fiber that happened in the late part of the last century and the early part of the first decade of the 21st century. And the fact that there was then the .com crash of the end of the 2008, that sort of thing. So there's been a lot of ups and downs along the way from a business perspective, but I would like to think that from a technology and a technology maturation perspective, we have always been on an upward slope, and it continues that way today. But coming from my background, I had a lot of kind of core scientific method approaches to things because I was actually used to working in laboratories and that sort of stuff. And whether I was doing, more social science oriented experimentation in the psychology side, or whether I was doing, biochemistry on the quote hard science side, that was my way of approaching problems, was to look at them as an experiment. And what's the hypothesis you are testing? How do you set up an experiment to test that hypothesis? What are the results of that? And where do you go from here? And that was useful in decomposing the problems that would occur in my IT job going forward. They were all basically, how do I solve things? what do I apply to stuff? The other thing that was really useful to me was I had an intense interest in the things that were going to be the underpinnings of the internet, mainly Unix and the BSD version of Unix in particular. I got early exposure to that when I was in college, running on Vaxes, and that whole community really excited me. It was a very collaborative space in which people would say, well, there's this problem, and then people would write tools and solve that problem, and then they'd move on to either refining those tools or creating a new tool set to do something new. So that was something that always excited me.
Awesome. That's a great intro. And yeah, we share a lot of kind of, I think, kind of general approach and thoughts and thinking towards things. There's a lot of stuff there already that I want to dive into. I think maybe first to start kind of where you started, in your introduction to mine, we both mentioned that you started, your first IT and or digital infrastructure job, however you want to call it, back in 1984, which was in many ways a different world than 2024. I have to imagine that job itself looked a lot different than what folks might be doing today. And you kind of alluded to that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what a computer systems administrator actually did back in the 80s.
Yeah, my first job was working in support of a neurophysiology laboratory at Baylor College of Medicine. The leader of that laboratory, a guy named Dr. Johnson, a great guy, works at UT now. He started at Baylor when I was there. Had this idea that it would be great to build a laboratory to acquire signals from test animals of a part of the brain called the hippocampus by using this data acquisition computer, which was using a Unix core platform running on it called MassComp. It was a Boston, Massachusetts-based company. Had a System 5, a Unix System 5 for people out there who know what that is, based operating system. And it would acquire data from these hippocampuses in rats and send that data over a network to another computer, which would then analyze that data and create a visualization of that data. And that my core job was to keep that laboratory network running. And that's where I really built up my expertise, both in being a Unix system administrator and in Ethernet, which we had the orange cable with vampire taps, all that kind of thing, way back in the beginning of Ethernet as a technology.
Yeah, wow, that's really, really cool. And I think that idea, that's something that, I was lucky enough to be kind of maybe the next generation behind you in networking. And so I got to learn from you and others about, thick net and thin net and the vampire taps. And, it feels like networking was a lot more physical the further back in time you go.
Yeah, no, that's a true statement. I mean, when Ethernet first came out, there was a lot of concerns about, packet collisions and all of that kind of thing, and imperfections in the physical media that really caused you to have to be really cautious about how you handle those things. But it was resilient enough that you could assemble it without having a clean room environment or anything like that. So even though you had to be careful, you didn't have to be so careful that, you were having to look at every little detail of what you did. But there were the things that were kind of confounding at times of, do you have your cable terminated properly, or is there some sort of crosstalk going on the line, that sort of thing. Having the tools we have today to debug that stuff would have been handy back then, but we didn't have any of that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I had to build it along the way.
The good thing about that job is it provided me an opportunity to demonstrate my problem solving capability and my organizational capability, to put together these projects so that it got the attention of the executive management at the medical school. And they said, hey, we really like what you did at this scale, this laboratory scale. How about you come do it for the whole college? And so I became the network manager for Baylor College of Medicine and deploying their first enterprise network.
Wow, that's really cool. That'd be a heck of a project.
It was even more intensive than that because I don't know if you know much about Houston, but Baylor is in the middle of a place called the Texas Medical Center, which is um, more than 30 institutions all in a campus environment. And as opposed to being like a typical college campus, each of the entities are independent. So I had to hone my skills not only in the technology to deploy a network across that campus, but the soft skills necessary to interface with all the different administrators and faculty at these different independent institutions. And I helped organize, for lack of a better way to put it, councils of people who'd work together, collaborators who would work with me to get these networks deployed. And we ended up extending Baylor's enterprise network to all these institutions that Baylor had affiliation with across this fairly large campus. And so we had orange cable running all over the place. And then we replaced chunks of it with FDDI because fiber was the future. And we thought FDDI was the answer, even though it turned out not to be long term. But, it got us faster speeds and a higher degree of reliability in terms of the networking infrastructure. And then as the technologies kind of matured, we then started to look at, how could we light up the fiber we had deployed with even better lasers, optics, if you will, to, get more and more speed out of it. And then along came, what we now think of as wired internet, where the drop cable was replaced by, telephone wire, for lack of a better way of putting it. What we now think of as Cat 6 and so on, and the network kind of matured into a large switched environment. Now, we learned the advantages of switches over repeaters and all of that stuff as part of that activity. And we were trying to put a computer on everybody's desk, so that work could be done. This is well before Wi-Fi happened and all of that. So we were doing wired twisted pair ports to every desk so that everybody could hook up their, what was the desktop computer of the day.
Yeah.
An IBM PC clone or equivalent.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. And I think, it's interesting to me that, kind of this, your first experiences at Baylor in the 80s and 90s involved this kind of cross-organizational collaboration, pulling these people together from different organizations in order to kind of deploy this new technology of networking across all the campus. To me, I see a reflection in that in a lot of the work we did together or have done together around IPv6, right? You've been the director of the Texas IPv6 task force since 2009. And at least from my perspective, I see some corollaries there in that, promoting the adoption of IPv6 is very much that kind of collaboration, cross-organizational communication, getting people on the same page. Did you see that same reflection there? Has that kind of been a theme through your career?
Yes, that's been a big theme. After I left Baylor, I went to work for what was the NSFNet regional network in South Texas at the time called Sesquinet, which was a collaborative activity between Rice University and Texas A&M University and many of the universities kind of there in South Texas. And we worked collaboratively to deploy this, for lack of a better way of terming it, regional area network that was at that time running over 56K and then T1 and all of that kind of thing, ultimately resulting in the first, T3 deployment that I was involved with late in the part of the 80s, early 90s. As far as IPv6, that came about because I had done deployments of IPv6 at the first internet service provider I worked for, which is a company called Verio, which was bought by NTT, the Japanese phone company. And when I was working at that company, the folks in Japan, who were owners, of course, wanted to deploy IPv6, but they didn't know exactly how to get it done. And fortunately, the company I was working with, the people there I was working with, there are many people you may have heard of, like Randy Bush. That was the first time I worked with him, was there. The people there were very supportive about deploying V6. And so I had to develop, I was the operations manager there. And so I had to develop operational support approaches to supporting IPv6 on a global internet network. NTT actually operated the seventh largest internet in the world at that time. So we weren't as big as WorldCom or Level 3 or those guys, but we were in the mix, I guess, in the hunt, as they would say. But because of that experience, that led me to want to be part of the emerging educational / evangelical or evangelist activity of promoting IPv6 just generally, because we were definitely seeing advantages on the service provider side to running IPv6, and we wanted to find ways to encourage all kinds of internet users to say, look, let's really invest in this technology and make it go. We had a lot of things going on from, the middle of the 2000s up through about the middle of the 2010s, where we made a lot of progress in their area. We worked with the large internet companies, Google and Microsoft and several others, tons of service providers. T-Mobile was just kind of getting started at that time, so they were saying, well, we won't really bother with deploying a V4 network. We'll deploy IPv6 as our core network, and we'll do that. And of course, the cable companies at that time were trying to evolve from the at-home model to a different model where they were operating their own networks. They were trying to figure out, well, how does IPv6 fit into what we were doing? And so there were a lot of exciting things happening on that front. IPv6 came along at a good time and one of the key factors in doing that, frankly, was Microsoft Windows kind of evolved to have IPv6 kind of built in. And so it was easy for consumers who use Microsoft Windows to use IPv6 if it was available. And so that was very helpful as well. So we had cell phone providers selling handsets that did V6. We had, of course, the Windows platform deploying V6. And because of the migration models that the IETF had standardized, where IPv6 would be used if it could work, you didn't have to really do anything at an end node to make IPv6 work. It was transparent to the end user. And so it still is today. But we did find that at some point, even with the effort to evangelize IPv6, we did run into people saying, well, it costs a lot to do this, and we have to retrain our staff to do that, and so on. And there is some truth to all of that, but as we are now in 2024, it doesn't cost much to deploy IPv6. It's kind of built into everything now. And, products that are released which do not support IPv6 are definitely in the minority. You just don't see that much. Though, to me, the biggest problem that I see in that area is there are still products that are coming out that are IPv4 only, but it's not prevalent. It's not the lion's share of things that are new that are coming on the horizon.
Yeah, definitely much easier to get it deployed now than ever before, I guess. And it keeps getting easier.
Yep. The resistance, unfortunately, is still there, which is confounding in a way. But
yeah, it's interesting how I think people who work in technology, which I think for most of us, we got into technology for similar reasons that you did, which is because it's so dynamic and it's changing, and that's fun to kind of be learning all the time. But still, as a collective, we seem to be resistant to certain things. There's certain changes we just can't wrap our heads around as a collective group of folks. IPv6 seems to be one of them. Network automation is another one that I'm wrestling with these days. And there's been others in the past too, but it's interesting how some things we can adopt new change really fast and easy, and other things tend to get resisted more forcefully.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with ruts. People get into ruts. They get into things that they understand. Certain technologists will, I have a recipe. It always works. If I do it this way, I'm just going to follow my recipe. But to me, that's a very slippery slope. Can't you can't spend your time doing the same thing over and over again, particularly if you're trying to, take advantage of what the latest and greatest is. I mean, the reason that the latest and greatest exists is because there's some value in it. It's not just there to give you something new to do. It's there to, improve the situation you're in. And the problem with IPv6 in particular is because it has so many key features that were new at the time V6 was developed that would have been part of IPv4 if IPv4 could have grown, that people are going, oh, I could do it this way now instead of the way I've always done it. And there are certain people in the community that are just resistant to change. Change is one of the things I've learned over my career, is that there are certain groups of people that are embrace change, and there are certain groups of people that are resistant to change. And if those people who are resistant are the ones who are trying to progress your information technology infrastructure, then you run into slow and what ultimately becomes obsolescence issues. So I try and avoid those situations when it's possible, but sometimes you just have to, charge on and hopefully make progress anyway.
Yeah. So speaking of kind of, I guess maybe challenges that are possible out there to face, the resistance to change being one of them. I'm really curious, and I hope you don't mind me asking this, but with a 40-year career now, I mean, one, obviously you've been able to do a lot of really amazing things for the internet and for all of us generally. But two, you're getting a little older now, right? 40 years is a long time to be working. You obviously went to college and everything before that. Has that ever come up through your career? 'Cause I know, I mean, just to set the context there, I definitely remember for myself when I was the youngest person in the room. And that definitely had an effect on me and people around me. I haven't yet come to the time where I'm the oldest person in the room. And I don't know if you have either, but maybe that's, I don't know if you've seen that evolve as your career has gone on.
Yeah, definitely. I know what it's like to be the oldest person in the room these days. One of the things that I learned toward the end of my career is it really depends on the culture or the place you're working for and whether they value the wisdom that comes with age or not. Some people do and some people don't. My most recent job was working for Google, and Google has a history of being kind of a youthfully oriented company. But I went to work for Google when I was in my 50s, which is at that time was very unusual when I started in 2011 there. But they were hiring to build a thing called Google Fiber, which was their ISP. They wanted to disrupt the ISP industry by laying fiber to the home. And that was a very novel concept in 2011. Today, it's much more ubiquitous. And one of the things Google did as a result of the Google Fiber activity was they were aware that to get up and running in a hurry, they actually needed people who knew how to build those kinds of things, because Google at its core is a software company. They're not an infrastructure company. They have gotten much better at building infrastructure over the 11 years I worked there. But on the on the ISP side, they didn't really know much of anything about deploying fiber to the home. They knew about acquiring IRUs from fiber providers and lighting IRUs, but as far as putting cable in the ground, they didn't have any real experience there. So that was kind of how I got started at Google, was to use the fact that I had experience at doing internet operations for, by that time, 20 years, and help them build up an operations capability that they didn't have. and they didn't have really that experience at all. So the bad thing that happened was that they dumped a lot of money into Google Fiber and built it up very quickly and kind of went too fast. They deployed too quickly, and it turned out to be a little bit unsustainable. So they had to pull back a little bit. That was kind of how I came across age as being kind of a factor that colored my work life, because I was working uh, with these kids out of college or people who were early in their career. And if you know anything about Google's culture, there is a move fast and break often kind of mentality, because that's just how they got things done. And one of the things that Google Fiber as a entity struggled with was the fact that breaking stuff is not really a good way to engender positive support amongst consumers. And then learning that that's not really the best way for them to go about doing it at the scale they're trying to do it. They need to, slow down and do it right the first time, and not try and have to go out and do it over and over and over again until they get it right. That's just not the way to build an ISP. Later in my career at Google, I moved into, working more in the planning activities for networking in the data centers of Google. And that was more of a program manager analyst activity. One of the things throughout my career has been, do I want to be a manager or do I want to be a technologist? And when I started at Google, I was really hired to be a manager and building up, the operations organization by hiring people and so on. But the latter part of my career, I was really more oriented towards doing more of an analyst role and trying to figure out how do I take the toolbox that Google provides to deploy networking in your data centers and allocate those resources to, save money, but also address the needs. And I always enjoyed both aspects of that. I liked being a manager, but I also liked doing the technology planning stuff. And that was always a point of tension within myself between which do I like to do more now, and how do I spend the time keeping myself engaged, but also helping people be successful in their careers. I found it all rewarding. Well, it really depended on the people I was working with. When I was hiring people, I always tried to hire people that I knew had a vision that was similar to mine. I mean, it didn't have to be identical to mine, but they needed to be excited about working with the technology and supporting the technology and addressing the customer need. Those are all things that I think are core to being successful as an information technologist. If you get too locked in on the technology, but you lose sight of the end goal, which is ultimately to provide a service to somebody, I think that blinds you to certain things, and you make decisions that they're not going to give you the best outcomes. If you're able to integrate those things so you are able to deliver a good service while taking advantage of the latest available technology, that gives you, I think, the best results. And so that was always the thing I looked for in people to hire, to try and be sure I was picking people who were thinking like that or had the capability of thinking like that. The light bulb may not have quite gone on yet, but you could see that the light was flickering, and a little bit of training or encouragement would help them, latch onto that idea as being a core principle. The problem with being a manager, I think, is that if you do that too much, if you are hiring people and training them all the time, and you don't actually get your hands dirty yourself, you lose the capability to get your hands dirty. And that, I think, is a slippery slope.
Yeah, it is. And it is tough to balance. I find for myself these days, I actually kind of use the idea of kind of time chunking, I think some folks call it. And I try to dedicate certain days of the week to different activities. So in general, my Tuesdays and Thursdays are kind of my manager days, where I spend a lot of time in meetings and talking to people and that kind of stuff. And I try to reserve my Wednesdays and Fridays in particular for kind of more deeper technical work. That's how I've kind of tried to find that balance. Sometimes it bleeds over. It's not always perfect for sure, but I definitely appreciate that tension there between the two. I don't know if you have any, other ways that you've tried to stay active in the technology while also being a good manager that's worked for you.
One of the things that's really helped me is to read voraciously. I try and follow all of the light reading. Light reading, I love to read because it gives me summaries of what's going on in the industry. It's not always a perfect view, but it's a good place to look, lightreading.com, and I recommend it to people. I also keep my ear to the ground on what's going on in IETF, even though I'm not actively participating in it right now, because that's where people are trying to decide what's really important for us to develop as technologists to accelerate internet work. And so reading the mailing list associated with IETF is something else I do that keeps me aware of that sort of thing. So to me, it's reading all the time and reading those kinds of resources. And then hopefully every now and then I get a opportunity to go to something, go to NANOG or something like that and talk to people who are doing this stuff and asking them what they're learning and where they think the next thing that we need to worry about is. One of the problems when you're an operations guy like I am is operations is always dynamic. You're always being yanked somewhere to do something, to fight some fire, and you don't always have control of where the fires are. And so while allocating 2 days a week to do something and 2 days a week to do something else is a really great goal, I always found that I couldn't be quite that regimented and solve the problem that popped up on Tuesday when I'm supposed to be doing technology stuff. And really, I need to spend time coordinating resources to resolve something.
Yeah, that's very, very true, for sure. The outages don't wait for us. That's a good point.
Outages are, they're not fun.
No.
Particularly when the outage was human induced and not induced by some other thing like, natural disaster or whatever. The thing I always used about outages that were human induced is I always say, okay, how can we change the process around the troubleshooting of whatever that particular item was, or maybe the change control mechanism that was used for that thing that created that gap. And then I try and say, okay, can we change the process to avoid this in the future? If you can turn it into a learning moment, then that's value. If you can't do that, that's a problem, because then it'll come up again in some other context. So that was always my approach there. I never looked. That was one thing I always really appreciate about Google. Google has a blameless culture where they don't say it's your fault. They always say it's the process's fault.
Sure, we can fix this process. Yeah,
yeah, because if the process is good, you won't have those errors because the process would catch it. Now, that's not to say that humans don't make mistakes; they absolutely do. But if the process is well developed and well understood, the problems minimize themselves.
Yeah.
And that was really something I always appreciated about Google.
Yeah, and I like your perspective on it too, right? I mean, I think failure is only a failure if you don't learn from it. In some ways, I'm rephrasing what you said there, but I think that's, really important. But then also I really like that idea of kind of what I would call maybe embodied learning, right? Where let's not just like learn the lesson, let's actually take that lesson and embody it into the methodologies we're using, the processes we're using, the next plan we write up, we'll take account of it and actually building that into the systems we use around us so that the mistake almost can't be made again. I really like that approach and that thought. Unfortunately, speaking of outages, we are out of time. The time flies when you're having fun. Stan, thank you so much for sharing your story with the Imposter Syndrome Network. And thank you to all of our listeners for your time, your attention, and your support. If you found this episode insightful or interesting, please consider paying it forward by letting others know about this show and the great guests we have on. Stan, though, before we totally close out and turn off the mics here, I would love to hear, if there's one piece of advice that you have, for folks that are maybe new to digital infrastructure and IT and operations. I think your years of service have hopefully built up to a lot of experience, or have definitely built up to a lot of experience. Anyway, I wonder if you could pick out one lesson that you'd like to share with folks who are listening.
Well, I think the biggest lesson is never stop learning. Things are always going to be changing. That's part of the reason I really like IT. It's always changing. So you need to always remember that you need to keep learning. And it doesn't always have to be courses you take or certifications you get. It can be other things too. Always look for an opportunity to learn. That would be my key recommendation to anyone who's listening.
I love it. I think that's great advice. Hopefully everyone takes it. And we will be back next week.
Seems to be a prevalent point of view that adding IPv6 to their infrastructure is costly. The fact of the matter is that it's easier now than it ever has been. Does that mean it's perfect? No, but neither was IPv4.
And it's still not. You can still buy gear that does it wrong, right?
Right.